What's up, knowledge seekers? In 2025, President Trump launched massive tariffs targeting numerous nations, with China facing the biggest hit. Some Chinese goods now carry tariffs exceeding 200%. But here's where it gets interesting. Trump simultaneously accused China of deliberately weakening the yuan to circumvent these tariffs. This probably makes you scratch your head. Why would any nation want their currency to lose value? Don't all countries strive for strong money? What China's allegedly doing might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually a calculated economic strategy called currency devaluation, or some call it manipulation. So what exactly is currency devaluation? Why would countries intentionally weaken their own money? What methods do they use? Is this strategy fair play or economic cheating? Does a weaker currency actually harm a nation? And yes, we'll explore the famous Plaza Accord, where America itself orchestrated currency manipulation. Today, we're diving deep into everything you need to understand about currency devaluation and manipulation. Ready to uncover why weak money can actually be a powerful weapon? Let's jump in. Defining currency devaluation versus manipulation. Currency devaluation occurs when governments intentionally reduce their currency's value against other currencies. This differs significantly from currency depreciation, which happens naturally through market forces. Depreciation is organic. It occurs when a nation's economy struggles, foreign investors lose confidence, and market participants sell that currency in response to fundamental economic weaknesses. Market forces drive depreciation without government intervention. Devaluation, however, is deliberate government policy designed to achieve specific economic objectives. Governments actively implement measures to reduce their currency's value for strategic purposes. Then there's currency manipulation, which involves governments actively controlling or influencing their currency's exchange rates. Not every instance of currency management qualifies as manipulation. Many nations, particularly export-oriented economies, routinely manage exchange rates as standard economic policy. This becomes controversial when countries lack transparency, artificially suppress their currency values for extended periods, or make their exports unfairly competitive, at least according to trading partners. When countries cross these lines, they might earn the currency manipulator label. But this designation is largely political rather than technical, since no universally accepted definition of currency manipulation exists. The distinction matters because currency management is common and often legitimate, while manipulation implies unfair trade practices that distort global commerce. Now you're probably wondering why any nation would deliberately weaken their own money. Doesn't stronger currency always benefit a country? Let's explore the surprising reasons behind intentional currency weakening. Why nations choose currency weakness. Initially, deliberately weakening your currency sounds like economic self-sabotage, but in macroeconomics, it's actually a sophisticated policy tool with several strategic benefits. The primary motivation is boosting export competitiveness. Here's how this works in practice. Imagine $1 equals 6 Chinese yuan. A Chinese manufacturer produces electronics costing 6 yuan per unit. When exported to America, buyers pay exactly $1, since the exchange rate makes this conversion perfect. Now, suppose the US government imposes 25% tariffs on Chinese electronics. That same product now costs American consumers $1.25. Suddenly, Chinese electronics become less attractive compared to domestic alternatives or products from other countries without tariffs. To counter this disadvantage, China strategically weakens its currency. Now $1 equals 7 yuan instead of 6. The same electronic device still costs 6 yuan to produce, but when converted to dollars, it becomes approximately 86 cents. After the 25% tariff, the final price reaches about $1.08. Still more expensive than before, but significantly cheaper than $1.25. Countries don't implement such devaluations overnight or dramatically. They adjust gradually, subtly, and strategically, avoiding announcements that might trigger retaliation or market panic. You might wonder why small changes matter. When national exports total hundreds of billions of dollars, even modest currency adjustments create enormous competitive advantages. This strategy allows nations to partially offset tariffs while maintaining export profitability. This explains why Trump and American manufacturers frequently complain about the dollar being too strong, making US exports expensive and less competitive internationally. The second benefit is creating invisible import barriers. This might sound contradictory. How do expensive imports help a country? Remember that nations use tariffs to make foreign products costlier than domestic alternatives, encouraging consumers to buy locally produced goods. But tariffs trigger retaliation. If you impose tariffs on another country, they'll typically respond with reciprocal measures, as we saw during the US-China trade conflicts. Currency devaluation achieves similar effects to tariffs, but more subtly. It makes imports more expensive relative to domestic products without violating trade agreements or triggering immediate retaliation. While slower and less dramatic than tariffs, this approach avoids diplomatic conflicts while protecting domestic industries. However, like tariffs, currency devaluation can contribute to inflation by making imported goods more expensive for consumers. The third advantage involves debt reduction through inflation. Consider a hypothetical scenario. The Land government borrows $10 million Land dollars from domestic lenders. Years later, the government implements policies causing inflation, reducing the currency's purchasing power. That $10 million now buys only half as much as when originally borrowed. But the government still repays exactly $10 million, the same nominal amount, but with significantly reduced real value. Through inflation, often triggered by devaluation, governments effectively shrink their debt burden when obligations are denominated in domestic currency. This strategy only works for domestic currency debt. If governments borrowed in foreign currencies like US dollars, currency weakness makes repayment more expensive, not cheaper. Clever economic maneuvering, isn't it? Now let's examine the specific methods countries use to weaken their currencies. Currency weakening methods. Countries can't simply change numbers on exchange rate displays to weaken their currencies. Instead, they employ sophisticated economic mechanisms to influence currency values through market forces. The first method involves reducing interest rates, typically implemented by central banks rather than governments directly. When you purchase government bonds, you're lending money to the government, which repays with interest based on central bank rates. High interest rates in countries like the United States attract international investors seeking better returns on government bonds and savings accounts. To invest, they need US dollars, creating demand that strengthens the currency. To weaken the dollar, authorities do the opposite, cut interest rates, reducing returns on bonds and savings. Investors lose interest and might sell their dollar-denominated assets, decreasing demand and weakening the currency. The second method is expanding money supply, also known as quantitative easing, QE. Central banks create new money and use it to purchase government bonds from institutions like commercial banks. Banks receiving this new money increase lending to businesses and consumers, expanding the overall money supply. This expansion typically causes inflation, which reduces currency value. More money chasing the same goods and services drives up prices and decreases the currency's purchasing power relative to other currencies. The third method involves foreign exchange market intervention using currency reserves. Central banks buy or sell their own currency to influence exchange rates toward desired levels. Unlike the US, where the dollar floats freely based on market forces, some countries like China don't allow complete market determination. The Chinese government sets daily target exchange rates for the yuan, intervening when market movements deviate from these targets. If the yuan strengthens beyond desired levels, China can sell massive amounts of yuan in foreign exchange markets, increasing supply and reducing value. Conversely, if the yuan weakens too rapidly, China uses its approximately 3 trillion foreign currency reserves to buy yuan, supporting its value. This intervention method works quickly but requires substantial foreign reserves, especially when strengthening the currency against market forces. Understanding these mechanisms helps explain how countries influence their currency values to achieve economic objectives. Fairness and historical precedents. At this point, you might wonder, isn't this economic cheating? Can countries really manipulate currencies for trade advantages? This question sits at the heart of many international trade disputes. The United States has frequently accused China of exactly this practice. In 2019, the US Treasury designated China a currency manipulator after the yuan weakened beyond 7 yuan per dollar. China denied intentional manipulation, but America believed China deliberately weakened its currency to offset tariff impacts. Interestingly, no substantial punishments followed, and the US dropped this designation in 2020, highlighting the largely political nature of such labels. Actually, most countries manage their currencies to some degree. A fascinating historical example occurred in 1985 when the US faced massive trade deficits, particularly with Japan, which was emerging as an economic superpower. The US pressured Japan, Germany, France, and the UK to meet at New York's Plaza Hotel, reaching an agreement to deliberately weaken the dollar. This became known as the Plaza Accord. How did they accomplish this? Japan sold enormous quantities of US dollars from their reserves in exchange for Japanese yen. Flooding markets with dollars weakened the US currency while reducing yen supply. With steady yen demand but decreased supply, the yen's value skyrocketed faster than Japan anticipated. The strengthened yen made Japanese exports significantly more expensive overseas, hurting Japanese businesses' profits. To combat this, Japan slashed interest rates and printed money to provide cheap loans to citizens. Seeing cheap credit available, Japanese citizens borrowed heavily and invested frantically in stocks and real estate, creating one of history's largest asset bubbles. When this bubble burst in the 1990s, it triggered Japan's lost decades of economic stagnation. Currency devaluation can help exports, but it often triggers retaliation. After the 2008 financial crisis, many struggling countries simultaneously cut interest rates, printed money, and allowed currencies to fall to boost exports. This sparked a currency war where nations raced to weaken their money for competitive advantages. The danger occurs when too many countries pursue this strategy simultaneously, potentially causing global inflation, market instability, and damaged trade relationships. So is currency devaluation fair? The answer depends on perspective. Countries implementing these policies claim they're protecting their economies. Trading partners often view it as unfair competition. When everyone does it simultaneously, nobody gains lasting advantages. The real costs of weak currency. If weaker currencies boost exports, protect domestic businesses, and reduce debt burdens, this strategy sounds brilliant. However, currency weakness creates significant real-world consequences for ordinary citizens. The primary effect is inflation. When currencies weaken, importing essential goods like food, energy, and technology becomes more expensive, driving up prices across the economy. Countries like Turkey, which depend heavily on imports, suffer severe inflation when their currencies decline. Meanwhile, nations like China, which produce more goods domestically, can better withstand currency weakness and even profit from cheaper exports. The second effect involves eroding purchasing power. If salaries remain stagnant while living costs rise faster due to currency-driven inflation, people's real income decreases. You might earn the same nominal amount, but can afford significantly less than before. The third effect is widening inequality. When inflation rises, wealthy individuals often invest in assets like real estate to protect their wealth from currency devaluation. As more people compete for these assets, prices increase dramatically. This benefits asset owners but hurts salary-dependent workers who can't afford to invest. When wages barely cover living expenses, let alone investment opportunities, wealth gaps expand. Currency devaluation often makes the rich richer, while making the poor relatively poorer. Additionally, countries can't indefinitely weaken their currencies. If inflation spirals out of control, it doesn't just raise prices, it can destroy confidence in the currency itself. Once people and investors lose faith in a currency's stability, it can become worthless, as we've seen in hyperinflation scenarios. Successful currency management requires careful balance between gaining export advantages and maintaining domestic economic stability. So there you have it, the complete story behind why countries sometimes want weaker currencies. A weaker currency can make exports cheaper, protect domestic industries, and help reduce debt burdens. It's not always harmful. Nations like China, Japan, and even Switzerland have strategically used currency weakness when it served their interests. But it's not a guaranteed win. Weaker currencies can raise prices, erode salaries, increase inequality, and trigger damaging inflation, especially for countries dependent on imports. Is it cheating? Is it smart strategy? Or is it simply economic survival in today's competitive global marketplace? The answer is probably all of the above. Ultimately, it's not just about strong versus weak currencies. It's about who controls monetary policy and who bears the costs. The next time you hear about currency manipulation in the news, you'll understand the complex motivations and consequences behind these economic strategies. Currency policy is never just about exchange rates. It's about balancing national competitiveness with citizen welfare. If you found this deep dive into currency strategy helpful and want more economics explanations made simple, hit that like button and subscribe to Knowledge for Dummies 101. What economic mystery should we unravel next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and remember, in economics, even weakness can be strength.